My friend, have you ever felt that your prayers hit the ceiling and fall back down? Have you ever whispered your pain into the darkness and wondered if heaven was listening? There was a time when I, too, questioned the power of prayer, until I discovered that prayer doesn't just change things, it changes you. Today, I want to talk to you about something that can transform your entire life. Not through wealth, not through fame, not even through human strength, but through the power of prayer. Stay with me, because by the end of this message, you'll understand that prayer isn't just a habit. It's the heartbeat of a living relationship with God Himself. 2:1. The power of prayer as a divine connection. Prayer is not a speech we give to the air. It is a conversation with the Creator of the universe. When you bow your head, when you whisper His name, you are speaking to the same God who carved the mountains and calmed the seas. Prayer bridges the gap between heaven and earth, between your weakness and His power. When you pray, you are never alone. You are entering the throne room of grace. Every time you pray, you plug your life into the greatest source of strength the world has ever known. 2:2. Prayer transforms the heart before it changes circumstances. Many people come to prayer hoping God will change their situation. But friend, the greatest miracle happens inside of you. Prayer molds your heart, humbles your pride, and fills you with divine peace. When you pray, God may not always change the storm around you, but He changes you in the middle of it. You learn patience, faith, and trust that cannot be shaken by the winds of life. 2:3. Prayer brings peace amid storms. There's a kind of peace that money can't buy and the world can't steal. It's the peace that comes from prayer. When your soul is anchored in prayer, you may still walk through valleys, but you'll walk with confidence, because you know the shepherd is beside you. In the darkest night, prayer becomes your light. In the fiercest storm, prayer becomes your anchor. 2:4. Prayer opens doors of the impossible. The pages of history and our own lives are filled with moments when prayer turned the impossible into reality. Mountains have moved, hearts have healed, and lives have been restored when men and women fell to their knees. When you pray with faith, heaven listens. When you pray with persistence, heaven responds. The impossible becomes possible because prayer invites God's power into human weakness. E5. A life of prayer builds a legacy of faith. A praying heart leaves footprints on eternity. The prayers you pray today can bless generations you'll never meet. A praying parent, a praying spouse, a praying believer, they build walls of protection and channels of blessing for those who come after them. When your life becomes a life of prayer, you don't just survive, you shine. You walk with God, and that light cannot be hidden. Conclusion, my dear friend, prayer is not a duty, it's a delight. It's not a burden, it's your greatest privilege. Don't let your day pass without it. Don't face your battles alone. Take them to the one who has already won the victory. When you pray, you invite heaven into your heart, peace into your mind, and purpose into your life. And that, my friend, is how powerful prayer truly changes your life. The power of prayer as a divine connection is one of the most beautiful and mysterious truths in the life of faith. Prayer is not a formal speech. It's not a list of demands or a ritual we perform because tradition says so. Prayer is the living breath of the soul. It is the invisible thread that ties the human heart to the heart of God. Every time you kneel, whisper, cry, or even silently think toward heaven, something powerful happens. The distance between you and God disappears, and you are brought face to face with the divine presence that created you, loves you, and still watches over you. Think about it. How incredible it is that the Creator of the universe, who set the stars in their places and told the oceans where to stop, is ready to hear you. He listens not only to the mighty and the famous, but to the broken, the forgotten, the weak, and the weary. He bends His ear to every honest heart. Prayer is that sacred moment when eternity meets time. When the infinite bends down to touch the finite, it is the soul's language of love, dependence, and surrender. There are times in life when you can't find anyone to understand your pain. Friends may turn away, family may not have the right words, and no one may see the tears behind your smile. But in those moments, prayer becomes your lifeline. When you pray, you are never alone. You are entering into fellowship with a God who knows your heart better than you know it yourself. He hears the words you cannot say, and He understands the tears that never fall. Prayer is not about perfect phrasing or eloquent language. It's about sincerity. A whispered, "Help me," from a sincere heart can move heaven just as much as a long, beautiful prayer said aloud. Because what God listens to is not the beauty of your words, but the honesty of your soul. The power of prayer lies in its authenticity. It's not how loud you speak, but how deeply you mean it. When you truly pray, you're not sending words into the air. You're opening a direct line to heaven. You're connecting your weakness to God's strength, your confusion to His wisdom, your fear to His peace. You begin to see that prayer isn't just communication, it's transformation. Every time you pray, something changes, even if you don't see it right away. The connection with God strengthens your faith, refocuses your mind, and realigns your heart with divine purpose. The world today is loud, restless, and filled with distractions. People are constantly searching for peace in success, relationships, possessions, or technology, yet they often feel more empty than ever. That's because nothing in this world can fill the space that only God can occupy. Prayer fills that space. When you pause, quiet your heart, and lift your thoughts to heaven, you begin to taste the peace the world cannot give. It's the peace that whispers, "You're not alone. I'm here. I've got you." Some people think of prayer as a last resort, something to turn to only when everything else has failed. But prayer is not a backup plan, it's the master plan. It's the first and most powerful response to every situation. When you start your day in prayer, you don't just invite God into your plans. You invite His power, wisdom, and protection to guide every step you take. And when you end your day in prayer, you rest knowing that the one who never sleeps is watching over you. When you grasp that prayer is a divine connection, you realize that you are never too small to be heard by God and never too lost to be found by Him. Prayer doesn't depend on your status, your past, or your perfection. It depends on His grace. That means even when you've fallen, even when you've made mistakes, you can still talk to Him. God doesn't turn away from the brokenhearted, He runs toward them. Every sincere prayer opens the door for His mercy to enter. And here's the remarkable thing: when you pray consistently, your relationship with God deepens. You begin to hear His voice more clearly, not always as an audible sound, but as a quiet leading in your heart. Prayer becomes not just something you do, but something you live. It becomes as natural as breathing. You start to recognize His presence in small moments, the way He gives peace in confusion, strength in weakness, and direction when you're lost. That's why prayer is not an obligation, it's an invitation. God invites you to speak with Him, to walk with Him, to trust Him, to share your heart with Him. You don't need to have everything figured out. You just need to be honest, humble, and willing to come before Him. The moment you do, that divine connection is made, and the same power that raised mountains and parted seas begins to move in your life. So, don't underestimate the power of prayer. It's not a whisper into the void. It's a conversation with the Almighty. It's the place where fear is exchanged for faith, where weakness becomes strength, and where the impossible becomes possible. Prayer connects heaven to earth and turns ordinary people into extraordinary vessels of God's grace. And once you experience that divine connection, your life will never be the same again. Prayer transforms the heart before it changes circumstances. This is one of the deepest truths every believer must come to understand. So often, we approach prayer as though it were a spiritual transaction, a request for something we want God to do for us. We ask Him to fix situations, to remove pain, to open doors, or to change other people. And while God does hear and answer prayer, His greatest work often happens within us long before anything changes around us. Prayer is not only about altering our surroundings, it is about transforming the soul that prays. When we come before God in prayer, something begins to happen that is unseen yet incredibly powerful. The very act of humbling ourselves before Him softens our hearts. We begin to see ourselves and our circumstances through His eyes, not through our fears or frustrations. Sometimes God allows certain prayers to go unanswered, not because He is distant, but because He is doing a deeper work inside us. He is shaping our hearts, teaching us to trust Him more, and preparing us for what's ahead. You see, the moment you truly begin to pray, you enter into a spiritual process that changes your inner world. The burdens that once felt too heavy begin to feel lighter. The anger that once consumed you starts to fade. The confusion that once clouded your mind is replaced by clarity and peace. You might still face the same situation outwardly, but inwardly you are no longer the same person. That is the miracle of prayer. It doesn't always change the situation, but it always changes the soul. Many people come to God with hearts full of frustration and fear. They want instant answers and visible miracles. But God's timing is perfect, and His wisdom is greater than ours. While we wait for Him to move in our circumstances, He often moves first within our character. Prayer molds our hearts to reflect His heart. It teaches patience when we want speed, compassion when we want revenge, and faith when everything looks uncertain. Sometimes prayer is like a mirror. As you spend time in the presence of God, you begin to see yourself as you truly are. The masks come off, the pride fades, and you realize how deeply you need His grace. Prayer reveals the hidden attitudes of your heart, your fears, your motives, your weaknesses. And in that sacred revelation, God begins His work of renewal. He doesn't condemn, He refines. He doesn't shame, He shapes. Through prayer, you are purified, renewed, and strengthened from within. There's something profoundly humbling about realizing that prayer isn't about getting our will done in heaven. It's about getting God's will done in us. When you pray sincerely, you start to align your desires with His purposes. What once seemed urgent may no longer matter, and what once seemed unimportant may become the very thing you focus on. Prayer recalibrates the heart. It turns your attention away from self and toward the Savior. It transforms you from being a worrier into a worshiper. Think of the people in Scripture who were changed through prayer. Moses entered the presence of God burdened and fearful. But when he came down from the mountain, his face shone with glory. Hannah prayed with tears and anguish, but she left the temple with peace and hope. Jesus Himself, in the Garden of Gethsemane, prayed until His heart aligned with the Father's will, saying, "Not my will, but yours be done." In every instance, the outward circumstances did not immediately change, but the person praying was transformed. That is the secret of powerful prayer. When you pray long enough and sincerely enough, your heart becomes tender toward God. You stop fighting for control and start surrendering in trust. You begin to see that God's delays are not denials, they are seasons of preparation. Through prayer, your faith matures. You learn to walk by faith, not by sight. The heart that once demanded answers begins to rest in assurance. The soul that once doubted learns to believe even when it cannot see. And something else happens when your heart is transformed through prayer. Your relationships change. You begin to forgive more easily, to speak more kindly, to love more deeply. The same prayer that softens your heart toward God also softens it toward people. You start seeing others through the eyes of mercy instead of judgment. Prayer gives you empathy. It connects you not only to heaven, but also to humanity. The transformation that happens through prayer is subtle at first, like a sunrise slowly breaking the night. But over time, it becomes undeniable. The more you pray, the more your heart reflects the image of Christ. The fears that once paralyzed you lose their power. The bitterness that once poisoned your spirit is replaced by peace. The confusion that once blinded you gives way to clarity. Prayer, in its truest form, is not just asking, it's becoming. It's becoming more like the one you're speaking to. So, when you kneel to pray, don't rush to ask for change outside of you. Ask for transformation within you. Ask God to shape your heart, to purify your motives, to strengthen your faith. Because when your heart changes, everything else will begin to follow. Circumstances may take time, but a transformed heart is an immediate miracle. That's the real power of prayer. It takes ordinary people and makes them extraordinary through the quiet work of God's Spirit within. It turns pain into patience, worry into worship, and doubt into unshakable faith. And when your heart is changed, you no longer see prayer as a means to get something from God. You see it as a way to become something in God's hands. That, my friend, is how prayer transforms the heart long before it changes the world around you. Prayer brings peace amid storms. There are moments in life when the winds of uncertainty blow hard against your soul, when everything around you feels unstable, and your heart trembles beneath the weight of fear and confusion. We all face storms, some seen, some unseen. They come in the form of loss, sickness, disappointment, betrayal, or deep loneliness. The question is not whether storms will come. The question is how we will stand when they do. And the answer is found in one word: prayer. Prayer doesn't always stop the storm, but it gives you the strength to walk through it. It doesn't always calm the waves, but it calms the heart of the one standing in the middle of them. When you pray, you anchor your soul to something greater than the chaos around you. The world may shake, circumstances may change, but in prayer, you find stability in the unchanging presence of God. That is where peace is born, not in the absence of trouble, but in the presence of the Almighty. When you bow your head in prayer during a storm, you are saying, God, I may not understand what's happening, but I trust you. That simple act of surrender is where peace begins. It's not the peace the world gives, the kind that depends on comfort or control, but the peace that passes understanding. It's a peace that guards your heart like a shield when fear tries to invade. It's a quiet strength that whispers, you're not alone. I'm with you, even when everything feels uncertain. The reason prayer brings peace is because it shifts your focus. When you look at your problems, they seem enormous. When you look at God, your problems shrink in comparison. Prayer lifts your eyes from the waves to the one who walks on them. It reminds you that the same God who calmed the sea for His disciples still has authority over the storms in your life. Every time you pray, you're inviting His presence to rule over your fear, His calm to replace your anxiety, and His strength to sustain you when you have none left. In the middle of the storm, prayer becomes more than words. It becomes an anchor. It's the connection that keeps you grounded when emotions try to pull you away. It's the reminder that your faith is not built on circumstances, but on a faithful God who never changes. The winds may howl, but prayer keeps your heart steady. The waves may rise, but prayer reminds you that there is still someone in control of the sea. There's a quiet power in those moments when you pour your heart out to God in the dark, when no one else hears you and no one else understands. It's in those private moments of prayer that peace begins to grow like a seed planted deep within your spirit. You might not feel it immediately, but something changes inside. Your heart starts to let go of fear. Your spirit begins to breathe again. That peace may not change what's happening outside of you, but it transforms what's happening inside of you. Some people believe peace comes when everything is finally fixed, when life is smooth and every problem is solved. But peace doesn't wait for perfection. Peace comes when you choose to trust God, even when nothing makes sense. Prayer teaches you that peace is not a destination, it's a decision. Every time you pray instead of panic, trust instead of worry, and worship instead of fear, you are choosing peace over chaos. The Bible says, "Be anxious for nothing, but in everything by prayer and supplication with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God, and the peace of God, which surpasses all understanding, will guard your hearts and minds." That verse reveals the secret. Peace is not something you chase. It's something you receive when you pray. It's God's response to a surrendered heart. When you hand Him your burdens, He gives you rest. When you cast your cares on Him, He replaces them with calm assurance. Sometimes, the storms of life last longer than we expect. The winds don't stop and the waves don't settle. But even in those prolonged seasons of struggle, prayer sustains you. It becomes your shelter in the storm. Each prayer builds faith. Each moment of surrender builds endurance. Slowly, you begin to see that the storm is not meant to destroy you, but to deepen your trust. Through prayer, you discover that God's peace is not fragile, it's unbreakable. And the beauty of this peace is that it doesn't depend on circumstances. It flows from relationship. When you spend time in prayer, you grow closer to God, and the closer you are to Him, the more peaceful you become. Because peace isn't the absence of fear, it's the awareness of His presence. When you know that the Lord is with you, you can face anything with courage. Even if the storm rages, your heart stays still because you know who holds your hand. When life feels too heavy to carry, prayer reminds you that you were never meant to carry it alone. When your heart feels overwhelmed, prayer is the doorway to peace. You can walk into God's presence with trembling hands and leave with steady faith. That's the power of prayer. It turns panic into patience and fear into faith. It doesn't always change the weather, but it always changes the traveler. So, when the storms of life rise around you, don't let fear be your first response. Let prayer be your anchor. Talk to God. Pour out your heart. Cry if you must, but never stop praying. Because the peace that comes from prayer is not temporary, it's eternal. It's the kind of peace that stays with you through the thunder, through the rain, and even after the storm has passed. Prayer doesn't promise you a storm-free life, but it promises you a storm-proof heart. And that heart, filled with God's peace, will carry you safely through every tempest you face. Prayer opens doors of the impossible. Every person, at some point in life, encounters situations that seem unmovable, problems too heavy to solve, dreams too distant to reach, and battles too hard to win. It is in those moments that human strength runs out and hope begins to fade. Yet, it is also in those moments that prayer becomes the key to unlocking what seems impossible. When you pray with faith, you are not speaking to chance or coincidence. You are speaking to the God who holds all power in His hands. Prayer doesn't simply ask for miracles. It invites them. The beauty of prayer is that it brings the supernatural into the natural. It takes what we can't do and places it into the hands of the one who can. There are doors in life that no human effort, no wealth, and no influence can open. But prayer has a way of moving those doors, not because of the power of our words, but because of the power of the one who hears them. Every time you pray, you are calling upon heaven to act in ways that go beyond human understanding. When you pray, you are connecting your limited ability to God's unlimited power. You may see a wall, but He sees a doorway. You may see an ending, but He sees a new beginning. Prayer is the act of faith that says, God, I don't see the way, but I trust that you can make one. It is a declaration of dependence, a spiritual surrender that turns the impossible into the possible. The same God who parted the Red Sea, raised the dead, and shut the mouths of lions is the same God who listens to your prayers today. The reason prayer opens doors of the impossible is that it removes the limits we often place on God. Sometimes we shrink our prayers down to the size of our faith. We only ask for what we think is reasonable or achievable. But God is not limited by our reasoning. He is a God of miracles, and when we pray boldly, we give Him room to show His power. There is nothing too hard for Him. When your heart is aligned with His will, your prayers carry divine authority. The impossible becomes possible not because you spoke it, but because He willed it. Many people look at their problems and think, it's too late, the damage is done. But prayer doesn't operate on human timelines. God can do in one moment what human effort cannot achieve in a lifetime. One sincere prayer can change the direction of an entire destiny. When you pray, you are not just asking for help. You are inviting God to perform what only He can. Miracles are not outdated stories. They are the natural result of a life that believes in the power of prayer. Sometimes, the miracle that prayer brings is an instant. It may not happen in a flash or in the way you expect, but every prayer sets something in motion in the unseen realm. Doors begin to shift. Hearts begin to soften. Paths begin to clear. Just because you don't see the answer yet doesn't mean God isn't working. Prayer doesn't just prepare the answer. It prepares you for the answer. It builds endurance, strengthens faith, and positions you to recognize the miracle when it comes. History is filled with examples of impossible situations changed by prayer. Families restored, nations revived, bodies healed, and lives transformed, all because someone chose to believe that God could do what man could not. And the same power that worked in the past is still alive today. When you pray, you are not just remembering what God has done. You are declaring what He can still do. Faith-filled prayer doesn't look at the size of the problem. It looks at the greatness of God. But to see the impossible happen, prayer must come from a place of unwavering faith. It's easy to pray when things make sense. But real faith prays when everything seems hopeless. It's the kind of prayer that says, even if I don't see it yet, I will still believe. That kind of faith moves mountains. That kind of prayer unlocks blessings that have been waiting on the other side of obedience. God honors persistent prayer, the prayer that refuses to give up, the prayer that keeps knocking until the door opens. Sometimes the greatest miracle isn't that the situation changes, but that you change in the process. Prayer transforms fear into courage and doubt into faith. It turns waiting into worship. When you pray through the impossible, you learn that the real power isn't in the outcome, it's in the connection. Because when you stay connected to God, even if the door doesn't open the way you expected, you'll find another door you never knew existed. That's how prayer works. It reveals divine pathways hidden to human eyes. Prayer is also an invitation for God to exceed your expectations. He doesn't just meet needs, He goes beyond them. You may be praying for provision, but God is planning abundance. You may be asking for healing, but God is preparing restoration. You may be praying for survival, but God is designing victory. The key is to pray with faith and then trust His timing. The impossible often takes longer, but it always arrives right on time. So when you face a situation that seems hopeless, don't stop praying. Don't let fear silence your faith. Keep speaking to the God who opens seas, breaks chains, and raises the dead. Even if the door seems locked, keep knocking, because heaven is listening. Every prayer you pray plants a seed, and when the time is right, that seed will bloom into a miracle. Prayer opens doors of the impossible, because it invites the God of the impossible into your situation. It shifts the atmosphere, it changes outcomes, and it reminds you that nothing, absolutely nothing, is beyond His reach. You may not see how, you may not know when, but when you pray, you can be certain that God is already at work. The doors that were once closed will open, not by your strength, but by His power. That is the mystery and the majesty of prayer. It turns impossibility into testimony and fear into faith. And once you have seen God open an impossible door through prayer, you will never doubt again that He can do it for you. A life of prayer builds a legacy of faith. Prayer does not only shape your present, it echoes into the future. Every prayer you pray, every time you bow your head, every time you lift your heart to heaven, you are laying stones in a foundation that others will one day stand upon. The impact of a praying life is not limited to one person or one generation. It reaches beyond time. When a man or woman chooses to live a life of prayer, they become a vessel through which God's power flows, not just for themselves, but for those who come after them. Prayer is not just a spiritual practice, it is a spiritual inheritance. When you live a life rooted in prayer, you leave behind something more valuable than wealth, titles, or possessions. You leave behind faith. The world may forget your name, but heaven remembers your prayers. And long after you are gone, those prayers continue to move in the lives of others. There are blessings your children will walk into because of the prayers you prayed today. There are storms they will never face because you fought them on your knees. A praying person doesn't just experience God's power, they pass it on. When you live in prayer, you teach by example that real strength doesn't come from the world, but from walking with God. Your children, your friends, your community, they watch you. They see how you respond to challenges, how you handle disappointment, how you find peace when others fall apart. And when they see you kneel in prayer instead of giving in to fear, they learn what faith truly looks like. You may not even realize it, but your prayers are shaping the faith of those around you. The power of a praying life is that it builds continuity between generations. When one generation prays, the next inherits the results. There are countless stories throughout history of men and women whose prayers outlived them, whose faith paved the way for others to know God. Abraham's prayers shaped a nation. Hannah's prayers gave birth to a prophet. The prayers of faithful believers have changed families, cities, and nations. And that same power is available to anyone who chooses to make prayer a lifestyle, not just an occasional act. When you live a life of prayer, you begin to see that every conversation with God has purpose. You're not just asking for blessings. You're cultivating a relationship. That relationship becomes the source of your strength, wisdom, and direction. And as you grow in that relationship, your faith becomes steadfast. You stop being shaken by circumstances because your confidence no longer depends on what you see. It depends on who you know. That stability becomes part of your legacy, a testimony to those who will face their own storms one day. A life of prayer also builds endurance. It teaches you to keep believing even when the answer hasn't come yet. It teaches you patience when the world demands speed, and that endurance becomes a lesson others will remember. People will see that you didn't give up, that you kept trusting God, and that your peace didn't depend on how easy life was. That is what inspires others to pray. A consistent prayer life becomes contagious faith. It stirs hope in those who are watching. There's something profoundly beautiful about realizing that prayer is never wasted. Every word you speak to God is heard. Every tear you cry is noticed. And every moment spent in His presence is recorded in eternity. You may not see the full impact of your prayers in your lifetime, but heaven does. God takes every prayer and weaves it into His divine plan. Some prayers are answered immediately, some over time, and some become blessings for the generations that follow. A life of prayer also builds legacy through spiritual protection. Your prayers create a covering over your family, your community, and your future. They become a wall of faith that stands firm against the trials of life. You might not always be there to protect those you love, but your prayers can reach places you cannot. When you intercede for others, you are building a spiritual shield that continues to work long after you've spoken the words. That is the power of a praying life. It doesn't end when the prayer does. And perhaps the most powerful part of a praying legacy is the peace it leaves behind. When you live close to God, your life radiates peace. And that peace becomes a gift to others. People may not remember every word you said, but they will remember the calm strength you carried, the quiet faith that guided you, and the love that overflowed from your time with God. Your prayer life becomes a living testimony, a light that points others toward the same source of peace you found. To build a legacy of faith through prayer, you don't need to be perfect, you just need to be persistent. You don't need fancy words, you just need a willing heart. Over time, your prayers will weave together a story of faithfulness. And one day, someone will look back and realize that the blessings in their life began with the prayers you once prayed. That is the quiet, unseen power of prayer. It plants seeds of faith that grow long after you are gone. So live a life that prays without ceasing. Let prayer be your first response, not your last resort. Talk to God in the morning, in the evening, in moments of joy and moments of sorrow. Make prayer the rhythm of your life. Because when your life becomes a life of prayer, you are not just surviving, you are shaping eternity. You are building something that cannot be erased, a legacy of faith, hope, and divine connection that will outlast everything else. The world may measure success by what you achieve, but heaven measures it by how you believe. And nothing demonstrates belief more powerfully than a life lived in constant communion with God. When your final days come, may it be said that you left behind more than memories. You left behind faith, prayer, and a living example of what it means to walk with God. Because a praying life is not just a life well lived. It's a life that keeps on giving, echoing through generations with the unending power of faith.